It began as a hushed exchange deep within the administrative wings of Buckingham Palace, an exchange never meant to leave the room. Yet within hours, aides were whispering about a sealed trust document tied to the Queen Mother's estate. King Charles was reportedly blindsided, and Camilla was noticeably absent from key briefings. Something long buried in royal financial history had resurfaced, and it carried consequences no one inside the palace was prepared to face. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Inside a tightly controlled private briefing room, King Charles was joined by senior trustees and long-serving estate advisors whose roles rarely intersect with public-facing royal duties. The atmosphere, by all accounts, was unusually restrained, no ceremonial language, no softened phrasing. Just direct references to documents that had quietly governed parts of the royal financial structure for decades. At the center of it all was a reference to the Queen Mother's historical trust framework, a legal architecture built on long-standing will provisions that had been preserved, updated only in form, never in intent. As the discussion unfolded, the tone shifted from administrative formality to something far more unsettling, as if the past itself had been reopened without permission. What made the moment even more striking was what was not being said. Camilla's name, according to multiple interpretations circulating among palace-adjacent legal circles, was absent from any beneficiary expectations tied to the original structure of the estate. It was not framed as an accusation or an omission of conflict, but as a simple, uncompromising continuation of older provisions that had never been designed to expand outward. Yet that silence in the paperwork created a louder tension inside the room. King Charles, usually composed in matters of state and protocol, was observed becoming increasingly withdrawn, his responses shorter, his attention drifting inward as if weighing implications that extended far beyond finance. Meanwhile, aides noted a growing unease, particularly when Camilla was excluded from early financial discussions under the justification of administrative clarity, a phrase that carried more weight than it revealed. Even more telling was the appearance of a sealed envelope, marked confidential, left untouched, referenced but never opened, surrounding the entire exchange with an unusual stillness that palace insiders later described as too deliberate to be routine. But what appeared to be a routine estate clarification was, in reality, the first crack in a decades-old royal financial architecture, one that had been quietly waiting to surface. The Queen Mother's estate was never just wealth, it was a fortress of legacy, sealed in legal precision and layered with decades of royal intent. Behind the public image of royal tradition lay a carefully constructed trust system dating back to the mid-20th century, one that quietly dictated how assets, residences, and income streams would be handled long after her passing. And within those documents, something unexpected was beginning to resurface. At its origin, according to various interpretations of royal financial history, the Queen Mother's estate structure was designed in an era when discretion mattered more than visibility, and continuity mattered more than convenience. What emerged from that period was not a simple will, but a multi-layered trust arrangement shaped through successive legal refinements, involving private estates, crown-linked residences, and personal holdings that were gradually absorbed into a protected framework. Over time, properties associated with her name became less about ownership and more about stewardship, locked into a system meant to outlast personalities and generations. Within this structure, the role of executors and trustees carried extraordinary weight. Palace-adjacent legal observers often describe such arrangements as self-reinforcing, meaning that once established, they resist reinterpretation unless formally dismantled, which rarely happens in royal practice. Trustees were not merely administrators, they were also responsible for overseeing the day-to-day operations of the organization. They were guardians of intent, bound to interpret decisions through the original lens of preservation, rather than modern adjustment. This is where the Queen Mother's estate gained its reputation as one of the most tightly controlled legacy frameworks in the broader royal financial architecture. What made it even more significant was how it reframed the very idea of inheritance. It was not designed as personal distribution in the modern sense, but as what some insiders refer to as protected lineage wealth, a structure intended to safeguard assets. for the institution rather than individuals. In this framing, even proximity to the royal family did not guarantee inclusion, because the system prioritized continuity of purpose over emotional or marital association. It was a financial philosophy rooted in restraint, not expansion. According to reports circulating among palace-adjacent financial circles, modern royal spouses were never positioned as primary beneficiaries within this older framework, a detail that had remained largely unexamined in contemporary discussions of royal wealth. This is where Camilla's position becomes structurally significant, not through any personal action, but through the simple fact that the original design of the trust system predated her entire role within the royal ecosystem. In that sense, her exclusion was not newly created, but historically embedded. And now, subtle signals emerging from trustee discussions, archival confirmations, and long-sealed references suggest that this dormant structure was no longer passive. It was being reactivated in interpretation, its boundaries quietly reasserted in a way that no longer allowed modern assumptions to reshape old intent, setting the stage for a confrontation between legacy design and present-day expectation. And yet, no one expected that these old protections were still active and still powerful enough to shape the present monarchy. According to multiple interpretations of the trustees' closed-door meeting, the confirmation was blunt and irreversible. The Queen Mother's estate would bypass Camilla entirely. No amendments, no reinterpretation, no discretionary inclusion. What had been quietly assumed in some modern circles was formally rejected in writing, triggering immediate concern among senior royal advisors. The trustees' formal clarification did not arrive as a dramatic announcement, but as a controlled legal communication steeped in precision and restraint. It reinforced what had long been embedded in the original settlement rules, that the Queen Mother's estate must remain bound to its founding intent, untouched by evolving expectations or modern reinterpretations of royal marital alignment. In that language of permanence, there was no space for negotiation. Every clause pointed backward, not forward, anchoring the estate in a framework designed to resist alteration regardless of shifting palace dynamics. Within that circa reality, one detail carried disproportionate weight. Camilla was explicitly not included in the beneficiary flow. It was not framed emotionally or politically, but structurally, as an outcome of original design rather than present-day circumstance. Yet within the palace ecosystem, structure often speaks louder than sentiment. What might have appeared as a technical exclusion immediately became a symbolic rupture, particularly given her position within the current royal household. Silence followed the confirmation, not confusion, but calculation. King Charles reportedly received the private written confirmation before wider circulation within advisory circles. Those familiar with the sequence of events describe a moment of stillness around him, a pause heavy with interpretation rather than reaction. For a monarch already balancing institutional responsibility with personal loyalty, the monarch must be aware of the potential risks and consequences of their actions. The document did not simply deliver information, it demanded reconciliation between past architecture and present reality. Advisors close to the situation noted that his responses became measured, almost withdrawn, as if each word from that point forward had to pass through layers of unseen consequence. Almost immediately, internal legal teams began reassessing the broader implications for royal finances, not because the estate itself had changed, but because its interpretation had suddenly become unavoidable. Questions that had remained dormant for years about alignment, influence, and structural boundaries within inherited wealth systems were now active concerns. The Queen Mother's estate, once treated as a historical constant, was being reevaluated as a living constraint on modern expectations, forcing advisors to map connections that had long been assumed rather than tested. At the same time, palace communication teams were instructed to maintain strict silence, a directive that revealed just as much as the trustees' confirmation itself. Silence in this context was not absence, it was containment. The priority was no longer explanation, but control of narrative pressure. Every corridor of the institution, from legal desks to private offices, began operating under the same unspoken understanding. This was not a routine clarification, but a structural moment that could not be allowed to spill outward unchecked. Within hours, the palace was not managing a clarification, it was analyzing a detonation of expectation. Sources close to the royal household suggest Camilla was visibly unsettled upon learning the trustees' position, reportedly viewing it not just as a financial exclusion, but as a symbolic rejection embedded deep within royal legacy structures. What followed was a period of tense recalibration inside Clarence House, as advisors attempted to assess both emotional and institutional fallout. The message did not arrive through ceremony or direct confrontation, but through carefully filtered advisory channels, an approach that itself reflected the sensitivity of the moment. Within Clarence House, the reaction was described not in dramatic gestures, but in controlled restraint. Camilla maintained composure, yet those present reportedly noticed a shift in presence. A subtle tightening of expression that signaled how deeply the confirmation had landed. It was not simply about assets or legal positioning, it was about placement within a legacy structure that had suddenly made its boundaries unmistakably clear. Almost immediately, private financial and legal advisors were summoned, not to challenge the trustees' ruling directly, but to understand its full perimeter. Discussions moved quickly into technical language trust limitations, historical settlement clauses, and the lack of discretionary pathways that might have allowed reinterpretation. Each layer examined only reinforced the same conclusion. The framework was not flexible in the way modern arrangements sometimes are. It was anchored, deliberate, and resistant to adjustment. The more it was analyzed, the more fixed it appeared. Alongside the legal review came a quieter but equally pressing concern how this exclusion might be perceived beyond palace walls. Advisors worried less about the internal mechanics and more about the narrative that could form in public discourse if the information ever surfaced in full. The risk was not just misunderstanding, but amplification, where a structural legal decision could be reframed as personal judgment. That distinction, fragile as it was, became central to every discussion that followed. Attempts were then made to explore whether any discretionary provisions might exist within the broader estate architecture, however minor or symbolic. But each inquiry returned to the same foundation. The Queen Mother's trust structure had been designed with precision that left little room for reinterpretation. What had once been seen as historical rigidity was now revealing itself as enduring legal architecture, untouched by time and resistant to modern recalibration. With each confirmation, the sense of finality deepened. Gradually, what emerged inside Clarence House was not just concern but recognition. Recognition that the framework in question was not reacting to current dynamics, it had been waiting, unchanged, while generations of royal evolution unfolded around it. That realization introduced a new kind of tension, one rooted not in what could be changed, but in what could not. But the true weight of the decision was not felt in Clarence House first, it was felt in the king's private chambers. King Charles, already navigating the immense pressures of illness, duty, and monarchy transition, is said to have been deeply affected by the trustees' confirmation. Insiders describe a moment of profound silence, less political, more personal, where legacy, marriage, and institutional responsibility collided in ways that could not be easily separated. In the aftermath of the confirmation, the king was confronted not with debate, but with finality. The legal clarity of the trustees' position left no room for reinterpretation, and yet its emotional weight extended far beyond paperwork. For Charles, the issue was never just procedural, it was deeply intertwined with the fragile balance between personal loyalty and institutional duty. Camilla stood at the center of that tension, not as a challenger, but as a presence now positioned outside the boundaries of a legacy system that had been quietly reaffirming itself without negotiation. Those close to the situation describe an atmosphere where silence became more telling than speech. Meetings continued in form, but his engagement reportedly shifted. There were pauses, extended reflections, moments where discussions moved forward without his immediate input. It was not withdrawal in the traditional sense, but something quieter and more complex, a recalibration under pressure. The weight of responsibility did not disappear, it simply moved inward. At the heart of this strain lay the enduring authority of the Queen Mother's legacy, a symbolic anchor that still exerts influence across the monarchy's internal frameworks. Her estate structure, long treated as historical found, creation rather than active force, had now revealed itself as something still operational in effect. For Charles, this meant confronting not only a legal boundary, but a generational one, an inheritance system that carried the imprint of a different era, yet continued to define present realities with uncompromising precision. Within advisory circles, attempts were made to soften the interpretation. The phrase most often repeated was historical continuity, not personal rejection, a framing designed to separate emotion from structure. It was an effort to preserve equilibrium, to ensure that institutional trust did not fracture under the pressure of private consequence. But even within those carefully chosen words, there was an acknowledgement of something unavoidable. The system was not responding to individuals, it was enforcing design. As the implications settled, Charles reportedly stepped back from select meetings, not as a formal retreat, but as a temporary withdrawal from decision-heavy environments. Those moments of absence were not filled with announcement or explanation, only adjustment. A monarch accustomed to balancing competing pressures now found himself positioned within a framework that allowed less flexibility than anticipated, where legacy architecture operated independently of present intent. And beneath it all, a deeper realization continued to take shape, the sense that what had been revealed was not a dispute to be resolved, but a structure to be understood. The architecture of inheritance, once assumed to be adaptable, was proving itself otherwise, reinforcing boundaries that could not be easily redrawn. And while the king processed the implications privately, others inside the royal machinery began preparing for structural response. Behind palace doors, senior royals and advisors began what insiders describe as a quiet containment strategy, not to reverse the trustees' decision, but to ensure its consequences did not destabilize the wider structure of royal governance. The focus shifted from emotion to control, from shock to protocol. What emerged in the hours following the trustees' confirmation was not panic, but precision. Senior advisors moved into coordinated assessment, reviewing financial exposure, constitutional sensitivity, and the broader implications for how legacy trusts interact with the modern monarchy. Every detail was treated, as a potential pressure point. Nothing was considered too small to matter. In this environment, stability was not assumed, it was actively constructed, step by step, through controlled decisions designed to prevent escalation. At the same time, an informal alignment began to take shape among key institutional figures, particularly Prince William and Princess Anne, alongside long-serving loyalists who had spent decades safeguarding the monarchy's operational continuity. Their position was not framed as opposition or correction, but as reinforcement, an effort to ensure that the institution remained insulated from interpretive collapse. Within this alignment, the priority was clear. The monarchy itself must remain untouched, even if surrounding expectations were shifting under pressure. The emphasis quickly turned toward preserving public confidence, a factor always present in royal decision-making, but now carrying heightened urgency. Advisors understood that perception could easily drift ahead of fact if left unmanaged. As a result, carefully structured internal messaging began circulating, designed not to reveal, but to stabilize. The language was deliberate, avoiding speculation, rigors, and steering discussion back toward continuity, tradition, and institutional resilience. Even silence was calibrated, used as a protective layer rather than an absence of communication. Simultaneously, deeper within the administrative framework, the concept of legacy trust boundaries was quietly reinforced. It was not a new policy, but a renewed emphasis on existing structural limits and acknowledgement that certain historical frameworks, once activated in interpretation, could not be reshaped without consequence. This reinforcement acted as an internal anchor, reminding all involved that the system was defined as much by what it excludes as by what it includes. In that clarity, the institution sought stability, even if it came at the cost of discomfort. Within this recalibration, Camilla's advisory access to financial discussions was subtly reduced, not through public declaration, but through procedural narrowing. Meetings continued, but the scope of her involvement in estate-related briefings became more limited, more filtered, and increasingly indirect. Those observing the shift noted that it was not framed as exclusion, but as refinement of roles and adjustment designed to reduce friction during a sensitive structural moment. Still, the effect was unmistakable within the internal rhythm of decision-making. And yet, even as containment strategies took shape inside the palace, they were already being tested by forces beyond its control. But containment inside the palace could not prevent the ripple effects already spreading beyond its walls. What began as a private trust clarification soon evolved into a silent but unmistakable divide within the royal ecosystem. Courtiers reportedly began adjusting access, briefings, and expectations, as if an invisible line had been redrawn overnight. The Queen Mother's estate had not changed, but the meaning attached to it had. In the days that followed, the change was not announced, nor formally acknowledged, but it was deeply felt within the rhythm of palace operations. Courtiers, long accustomed to predictable flows of information and influence, began to subtly recalibrate how financial discussions were handled. Access to certain briefings became more selective, timing more controlled, and the language surrounding estate matters noticeably more cautious. It was not a rupture in structure, but a recalibration of who stood closest to its most sensitive points. Beneath this surface adjustment, a quieter shift in influence dynamics began to take hold within household structures. Authority was no longer measured solely by position or title, but by proximity to legacy frameworks that now carried renewed weight. Those aligned with long-standing institutional continuity found their standing reinforced, while others discovered that their access once assumed was now conditional, filtered through newly emphasized boundaries. The monarchy did not declare change, yet change was unmistakably present in every interaction that followed. Outside the palace, observers and commentators began to sense what was described as an unusual financial silence. Not the absence of activity, but the absence of confirmation. The usual flow of interpretation and subtle signaling that often surrounds royal matters had been replaced with restraint. This silence, paradoxically, amplified attention. The less that was said, the more intensely every gesture, pause, and omission was analyzed, creating a vacuum filled entirely by speculation. As speculation grew, so too did the distance between perception and official acknowledgement. DG meant. Without confirmation from within the institution, interpretations multiplied, each one attempting to explain the same underlying tension in different ways. Yet the palace maintained its controlled posture, allowing no narrative to solidify beyond its walls. This deliberate restraint did not reduce attention, it intensified it, drawing focus toward what was not being addressed rather than what was being said. Within this shifting environment, Camilla's position began to be increasingly described in more restrained terms, often framed less through financial association and more through ceremonial presence. It was a subtle reframing rather than an official redefinition, but its effect was clear within the internal language of observers and insiders alike. Influence, in this context, appeared to be transitioning from structural participation to representational role, altering the tone of how her place within the broader system was perceived. Royal observers, long accustomed to reading the monarchy through subtle indicators rather than formal announcements, noted this shift in internal hierarchy tone with increasing clarity. The emphasis within discussions appeared to be moving away from fluid influence and toward reinforced boundaries, where legacy structures carried greater weight than contemporary positioning. It was not a collapse of roles, but a tightening of definition, as if the institution was quietly reasserting the limits of interpretation itself. And in the midst of this quiet restructuring, the monarchy was once again forced to confront its oldest truth. Legacy is never just inherited, it is enforced. In the end, the trustees' confirmation did not create a crisis, it revealed a boundary that had always existed. The Queen Mother's estate, locked in historical intent, stood untouched by modern reinterpretation. And within that silence, the monarchy once again revealed its defining principle. Continuity is not negotiable, even for those closest to the crown. What emerged from this final clarity was not chaos, but a deeper recognition of structure. The estate, long viewed through layers of modern expectation, was ultimately aligned with directives that had never shifted with time. Every clause, every restriction, every preserved instruction reflected a design that prioritized permanence over adaptation. In that rigidity, There was no hostility, only definition. A line drawn decades earlier, now simply reasserting itself with quiet authority. Within this framework, Camilla's exclusion was increasingly understood not as a personal judgment, but as a structural outcome embedded in the original architecture of the Queen Mother's intent. The distinction mattered deeply inside palace interpretation. It reframed the entire narrative from one of individual inclusion to institutional design, where eligibility was not influenced by proximity or status, but by the boundaries set long before present roles existed. In that shift, emotion had little space to alter outcome. For King Charles, however, the situation carried a different weight. Positioned between emotional loyalty and institutional responsibility, he found himself navigating a reality where neither side could be dismissed. The personal and the constitutional no longer ran parallel, they intersected in ways that demanded acceptance rather than resolution. Those close to the situation describe a monarch aware that some aspects of legacy cannot be reshaped, only understood and carried forward. At the same time, the internal balance of influence within the monarchy appeared to settle more clearly around figures seen as stabilizing anchors. Prince William and Princess Anne, often associated with continuity and institutional discipline, were increasingly viewed as the operational core through which long-term consistency could be maintained. Their presence did not signal disruption, but reinforcement and embodiment of structure over sentiment, and continuity over reinterpretation. As these dynamics settled, the monarchy's broader position hardened into something more defined. The continuity doctrine, long implicit in royal tradition, was now being expressed with renewed clarity. Adaptation remained possible in tone and presentation, but not in the foundational architecture of legacy itself. What could evolve was perception, what could not change was structure. That distinction became the silent rule guiding every subsequent decision. In this final framing, legacy emerged not as memory, but as control sealed, deliberate, and enduring beyond individual preference. And as the palace doors close on yet another unseen dispute, one truth remains unspoken but absolute: the crown does not bend to expectation. It bends only to legacy. Thanks for watching. Please don't forge. To like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.